Hey all. So every fall we, to some extent, depending I guess on who you are, celebrate, recognize Banned Books Week. And to a large extent, speaking personally, often that event, while raising awareness on book challenges as much as anything, because often it's challenges more than bans, it often had, for me, felt removed from the danger. And I think we're all aware of the rise of book challenges and book bans that we've been seeing over the past year, especially. We've seen an exponential growth. And to a large extent, too, a lot of this happens in silence. So the data is not perfect, but we're seeing a lot more reports of it for sure. And I believe that anecdotal evidence supports a growth period because we are surely seeing just as many unreported as ever. So we are aware of this to whatever extent we are. I have been thinking about this. I have been afraid of this for a while, but I wasn't really sure how to talk about it because I don't feel like I'm bringing enough knowledge to the table around it. But we need to talk about it full stop because it's happening. They are predominantly coming after books about people of color, predominantly the Black experience in America. They're coming after books from the queer experience, and they are coming after books that center both sexual health and sexual knowledge and liberation to whatever extent, and abortion. So they are obviously coming after largely vulnerable communities that they view as a threat to their narrative. And I'm going to be using that kind of ominous they that's not connected to anything, but you know. And I do not think that it is a coincidence that we are seeing this rise in challenges and bans at the same time as we are seeing a rise in misinformation. And so even in my own personal discourse around this, the things I've seen my friends saying, friends that aren't attached in any significant way to the librarian community, to a school board or a school community, to the literary community, really, other than reading things every once in a while, which they're definitely part of the community, but they're not mired in the discourse, I should say. They are like, why are they coming after these books when the internet exists? Which I'm not going to even touch that, but I'm afraid of what that may be a precursor for. But also, one, I think in relation to how far we still need to go in terms of representation for so many communities and how much work there is yet to be done, it's easy to forget how far we've come in a relatively huge asterisk there. You know what I mean? How far we've come. And I only say that because to those who are presenting these challenges, that growth is obviously seen as a threat because they want to control the narrative and they view these narratives as a threat. I'm going to be bopping around here mentally, which is part of the reason that I had kind of put off doing this because I feel like my trains of thought are moving in so many different ways all at once. And I also am trying not to be alarmist without actual rooted fact because I don't have my one semester of media law isn't going to get us far here, right? I recognize that. And so if you are an expert, a librarian, a lawyer, any of these things, I would love to hear your take on these challenges, these bans, and how best we respond and fight back against this. And I've done some research into that, and I will posit some of those action items for sure, but I'm always interested in what those with expertise have to say about the matter. But again, trying not to be too alarmist while my brain is on fire and screaming and running in circles in alarmism, when we see these kinds of threats to the narrative, right, that a place or a people or what have you have told themselves, and then we see the pushback against that, we've seen this before, is what I'm saying. And I'm trying not to draw too concrete of parallels, but at the same time, my brain feels like those parallels are there. So it's easier for these groups, these individuals, to push back against the narratives, the lives, the lived experiences, because so many of these are people's lived experiences or are nonfiction titles. And I'm pulling a lot of this from that list that leaked from the Texas challenges, or the contested books on that list, as well as a lot of the books we've seen genderqueer at the height and kind of the center of a lot of this discourse for sure as well. So many of these are people's lived experiences. And when people's lived experiences become a threat, I think back a lot to Mickey Kendall, who wrote Hood Feminism. And this was before that book came out. And that book, not ironically, probably is on the Texas contested list for sure, because obvious. So not verbatim here, obviously, but I remember her talking about at a book event in Chicago in relation to young adult, especially when we're seeing these narratives that are viewed outside the norm or that are so often at the center of these challenges. And to be fair, I don't think we were talking about it in relation to a challenge, but this idea of whose stories are considered valid and the idea that so many young people have been through such hard things already in their lives and that they have experienced a lot and seen a lot. And if we tell them that those experiences that they see mirrored, whether in their fiction or their nonfiction, are indecent, what are we telling them about their lived experience? And so much of this is going to come down to this idea of indecent and obscenity, because that is how they're going to go after this. And that is how we've seen it in Virginia. We have an open lawsuit where they're trying to come at these titles through the lens of obscenity laws, because that's how you get around the First Amendment. And again, it's been a long time since I took that one semester of media law, but we did talk about obscenity laws in a relation, especially obviously to media, and books are media, but we didn't dig too deeply because cursory, one semester. But that's what it's going to come down to. And I don't like the precedents that we've been seeing in the courts. And all of this is a position of a larger culture war, right? We've been talking about the culture wars for decades at this point. Honestly, a lot of it really stems back even to the 60s. And we've seen only a harsher divide since then, since the rise, especially of cable news. There's a lot of factors, right? This isn't an easy conversation with like an easy answer. But within this culture war, it's this fighting over the narrative and whose stories get told and whose stories are allowable, right? And it's also complicated by the fact that people on the other side of this, there's often an uproar, right, when a prominent politician or political figure that is involved in policies that have been very harmful to communities, especially, are given large book deals. And they often cry censorship and bring into question the First Amendment in relation to that. But here's the deal. The First Amendment, to my reading, and again, I am not a legal scholar, does not guarantee you a multi-million-dollar book deal with a large publishing house. So there's that. So these challenges, this uproar, this culture war, this fervor that we've seen in all avenues is also getting taken to literature, to books, and this idea of what narrative is getting told, because it's easier to view a narrative that is different or presents different points of view as a threat than to engage critically with it. And this is putting librarians on the front lines of this and putting their reputations at risk and putting their careers at risk. And it's part of a larger systematic issue of discrediting, one, a lot of professions that have been really respected historically, two, a lot of professions that historically have a lot of women in them, and that are wrapped up in this idea of critical thinking and narrative and engaging with the world, education. We're talking librarians, these kinds of careers. So in this world where it's easier and easier to funnel people down, rabbit holes online of radicalism, we are trying to control the narrative on the outside as well. That's not a complete thought, but that's kind of what we're looking at. But that doesn't take away, obviously, from the danger and the alarm of what we're seeing. And I think that we need to keep our eyes on it. And as I've been going through this research, I'm like, what do I do? What do we do? And part of it is keeping our eye on it, unfortunately, because that doesn't feel as active, but it's the facts. Like I said, so much of this, so many of these challenges are so silent for so long, and it's little decisions. Like heck, when I was working at my library many, many years ago, there was a decision not to acquire 50 Shades of Grey. And I do not have a master's in library science, right? So these are convoluted decisions. A lot of libraries, especially small town libraries, have very limited budgets. So sometimes you're not going to see every title in their period, and they are acquiring what is popular, what gets checked out. So there are layers to all of this, but we are obviously seeing pushback against acquisition, programming, what have you, that speaks to a more diverse and a conclusive experience. So again, going back, keeping our eyes on it, knowing when these challenges may be happening and being aware of it, speaking up when you are aware of it, whether it's at the library level in terms of your public library or community library, whether it's at the school board level in terms of school libraries. And I think schools are where we are also seeing a lot of this battled out. And this comes down to, too, what books people are allowed to teach and how the conversations around those books are allowed to go. And that breaks my heart too. This all breaks my heart, right? And that sounds so simplistic and small. That's such a small statement because it's so much bigger than that. But when I think of my own experience, there were a lot of ideas that we were engaging with in literature, and sure, we didn't read diversely enough at all in my reading experience in school, for sure. There were still ideas that we were engaging with. And a lot of these books that are being banned from schools to teach even would be asking or allowing students a way to engage with bigger ideas and have these conversations in a safe place to work through these ideas. I had a lot of really bad ideas when I was a teenager. My worldview wasn't fully formed. I didn't know things. And even what was probably a pretty standard, simple Socratic seminar discussion of Tess of the D'Urbervilles when I was in school fundamentally changed how I looked at things like consent and how that dialogue happens. Because again, I had no world experience. And so again, being able to engage with these ideas is important. And so as loud as the opposition gets, because oftentimes these things are a very vocal minority, right? And so it's easy to get complacent because it's like going back to this idea of Banned Books Week being celebrated, recognized, and it feeling removed of the danger and the immediacy of the reality of book challenges and book bans. And again, that might have just been my own problem, my own fault in that framing and in that remove. That may have been on me. And that's obviously something I need to interrogate as well. But we need to speak up when it's happening. We need to back up our support of these titles. And a way to tangibly back up our support of these titles, even when they're not under threat, is to actively engage with them. And so reading them, yes. And I know that there is a lot of discourse that always comes out around the, resurgence of a ban or the discourse around a ban or talk or what have you about bans, and people generally want to run out and buy the book. They want to buy the book for that community. They want to buy that book and put it in little free libraries. All good instincts, or instincts coming from a good place, for sure. But there's also a lot of discourse that ends up happening about how book bans actually lead to better book sales. And that is false. Sure, for some authors that are already big, maybe, but one, remembering that so many of these challenges and these bans happen in silence. One, two, when we see things like the Texas list, for instance, which was what I believe over 700 titles. I've looked through it a couple times. It is extensive. It's also a lot of nonfiction, which great, but we're not going to see the same support of all 700 of those titles equally. It's just not going to happen. And not all of them are going to become bestsellers. Not all of them have become bestsellers. So we see actual books die by this because we see a lack of support, a lack of acquisition, a lack of sales. Often these books are midlist titles. I think we often forget how many of these books are midlist titles. For instance, on the Texas list, I saw a book, Fans of the Impossible Life, which came out 5 or more years ago now, was always a midlist title. I was always kind of interested in it. I mean, I read it. It's maybe the one book that did second person in a way that I didn't want to throw my book across the room or couldn't finish it, because it followed like this trio of friends, and there was a little bit more complication to that, and some of them were queer, which is why it was on the list. But each person in that group got a point of view, and they were all told differently. One was in first person, one was in third, and one was in second. And I thought it worked, but that was always a midlist title to my knowledge. That's always been kind of midlist. So we're seeing lots of books like that that are falling onto these lists. So we can't take for granted that they're going to become bestsellers or they're going to sell well because of these challenges, because I think that that is an easy statement to kind of reassure us when we see these things coming down the pipeline, because it is unsettling. But it also removes a sense of action and responsibility from the whole puzzle piece. And I am, again, as always, not absolving myself of that lack of action. So engaging with these materials, reading them, buying them, sure, but also checking them out of the library and engaging with them, recommending them to other people in your community. When things are checked out from the library, it illustrates demand, and it makes it easier to keep those books on the shelves in the collection, because if they're not circulating, they're going to get weeded just to make room for things, not out of any maliciousness, but because there's not a demand for them. So illustrate demand, engage with those books. Don't just, put them to the side. And I'm guilty of this because I always check out way too many books because I have no self-control. So it's not like a malicious, like you feel like you're just checking it out and doing your good deed and putting it to the side. Sometimes it's you check out 500 books you really want to read, but you don't have time to read 500 books. So I understand. I get it. I'm there with you. But engage with them, read them, recommend them, show, illustrate, demonstrate that demand for those titles. If there is a title that your library doesn't have that you're interested in, recommend it for purchase. I can't guarantee it's always going to get purchased because I don't live in your community, but it's at least illustrating that demand and potentially introducing a new title into the collection. I am very lucky, as I've said many times, in that I am in Chicago with one of the best library systems in the country. And I think I've only had to recommend something for purchase a couple of times. And honestly, I probably was just excited about it and got there before a collections acquisitions librarian, I don't know their titles in a system this large, got to that. I think they probably would have gotten there on their own because it's very, very rare I don't find a title in the collection. But every title I've recommended for purchase has been purchased. And I recognize that that is a very privileged position, and that is supported by a larger budget. So to any of my librarians here who are working in a much smaller system, know that I recognize the work that goes just into curation. I don't fully understand all of it clearly because I do not have the same degree you have, but know that I appreciate the work that's being done there, and I recognize and appreciate that it is work and it is a more complicated, nuanced discussion there as well. So demonstrating demand. Lots of runaround to say demonstrating demand. Also, if you are in a place where you're seeing a challenge, you're seeing a rumbling, speak out about it, whether it is a letter to the editor, getting more eyes on the thing. I've read some articles, I believe it was through Book Riot, that talk about how the decline in local journalism has helped a lot of this too, because there aren't eyes on the ground as closely in every community, that we are not seeing that same level. And sure, Facebook groups are a whole other thing. Don't even get me started on small town Facebook groups. So keep your head up, and if you see something, speak out. That's not always comfortable, but unfortunately, I think we're past comfort. And I am saying that to myself as well. I'm saying that to myself as well, as someone who has been pretty conflict avoidant my whole life. So that's where we are. So keeping your head up, speaking out when you see something, reading, engaging, supporting, talking about these books, being engaged with these books, these experiences, these narratives, keeping those narratives alive, but also keeping the conversation and awareness of this going. So conversations like today, or, whatever today is for you if you are watching this, and I'd love, as I said, experts, people with thoughts, what have you, to give more action items as you know them, or things to be aware of, things to be watching out for, ways to support in the comments, because I too personally would love more action items. I feel as hopeless as I think a lot of us feel in this, especially because it can be hard to look at these challenges and feel like you can do something, especially when it's something like an obscenity lawsuit. And the obscenity lawsuit is very concerning. It's again very concerning for the minority populations or the underrepresented populations that it is clearly targeting, that these bans are clearly targeting. And I again want to reiterate that these bans are largely coming after diverse experience. And they've also, with this lawsuit, briefly mentioned, I believe it was a court of mist and fury, and I don't want to linger on this too long because I don't want it to overshadow what I think is the larger problem here. But it has also, shown a card of what could be coming next in all of this, right? They're not going to just stop there. And the fact that they're coming after what they're coming after already should be enough. So we should be concerned. We have made a lot of progress in the last decade, especially. And I know that feels like a very long time. We haven't made nearly enough progress. We are constantly fighting for better representation, and that fight for better representation also needs to continue. But we also need to protect and make sure to look behind to the books that we have and be protecting them, supporting them. And we need to be actively engaging with these texts. So I feel like I've said, as usual, a lot and absolutely nothing at once, because this isn't a problem we're going to fix, obviously, with a YouTube video. I've gone through that Texas list a couple of times, and it's really disconcerting how many amazing titles are on that list. Asked by Isabel Wilkinson, Felix Ever After, Darius the Great Deserves Better, Her Royal Highness, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, Fans of the Impossible Life, the Moonstuck graphic novels, Hood Feminism, La Bizona, Pet. So many good titles. That is obviously just a fraction. So I think we need to keep engaging with this. We need to keep our eyes on it. Like I said, keep speaking out, keep the conversation going, and keep supporting these books. So if there are books that have come up in these challenges that you would recommend, want to support, please leave those below, as well as any ideas, thoughts, what have you, around how to continue to keep pushing back against this. Because we are in a fight right now over narrative and whose story deserves to be told, and how that shapes the greater story of how we see ourselves. So let's keep up the fight, and leave your thoughts below. Thanks for hanging out with me through these thoughts today. Read something good, especially if it has been challenged or banned. And yeah,